I thought she was just visiting for a few days to help us settle into the new apartment. I had no idea that the woman I'd been calling Mom for 3 years was actually visiting to claim the place as her own, and that by the end of that week, she would raise her hand against me 10 separate times, citing a single unforgivable crime, a light left burning in an empty room. What made it worse, what made my stomach turn years later when I finally let myself think about it clearly, was that my husband Daniel stood in the doorway each time it happened and said absolutely nothing, not a word, not a single word in my defense, not a touch on my shoulder, not even a sharp intake of breath that might have suggested he understood the gravity of what he was witnessing. He stood there like a man watching weather, passive, waiting for it to pass. And that silence, I would later understand, was its own kind of violence. The apartment on Birchwood Lane had been mine long before Daniel came into my life. I'd bought it at 28 with savings I'd scraped together over 5 years of working double shifts at the hospital administration office, skipping vacations, eating packed lunches at my desk while my coworkers ordered in from the Thai place on the corner. It wasn't a grand place. 2 bedrooms, a narrow kitchen with a window that faced the courtyard, hardwood floors that creaked pleasantly underfoot in the mornings, a small balcony where I'd grown tomatoes in terracotta pots the first summer I lived there alone. But it was mine in a way that nothing had ever been mine before. I'd signed the papers alone. I'd carried boxes alone. I'd painted the walls a warm, ivory color alone, listening to jazz records and eating cold pizza straight from the box, and I'd felt something settle inside me. A quiet, solid sense of having arrived somewhere real, of having built the first true foundation of my adult life with my own 2 hands and nobody else's help. Daniel had moved in 2 years after we started dating, and for a while, everything had been exactly as good as I'd hoped it would be. He was an engineer, steady and calm, the kind of man who remembered to change air filters and research the best route before every road trip. I loved the way he laughed, fully, without reservation, head thrown back. And I loved that he made coffee before I was awake on weekdays and left it in my favorite mug on the counter. We had small, comfortable rituals: Sunday farmers market, Wednesday night cooking together, long walks after dinner when the weather allowed. His mother, Eleanor, lived 40 minutes away, and we saw her for holidays and the occasional Sunday lunch. She was a compact, sharp-featured woman in her early 60s, immaculately dressed even for casual occasions, with silver hair cut close and eyes that had a way of moving over a room like they were taking inventory. I found her slightly unsettling from the beginning, but I told myself that was uncharitable of me. She'd raised Daniel alone after his father left when Daniel was 12, and she wore that sacrifice like a second skin. Not ostentatiously, but as a quiet, constant reminder that she had paid a price the rest of the world couldn't fully appreciate. I respected that. I wanted to love her the way you love someone who shaped the man you chose. She called Daniel every single day, sometimes twice. I noticed it early on but said nothing because what was there to say? She missed him. He was her only child. He was patient with her, always stepping away from whatever we were doing to take her calls, sometimes for 20 or 30 minutes, and when he came back he'd be slightly quieter, slightly more distracted, and after a few minutes he'd be himself again and I'd let it go. There were small moments. A comment about the way I'd arranged the kitchen cabinets. Daniel always liked things grouped by use, not by size. An observation about the thread count of our new sheets. I just want him to sleep well, that's all. That left a faint metallic taste in my mouth, but nothing I could point to and name as a problem. She was his mother. He loved her. I was learning to manage my reactions, to file the small irritations away and not let them accumulate into resentment. Then we got married, and something shifted. Not dramatically at first, just a degree or 2 in each direction, barely perceptible. Eleanor began calling more, texting Daniel links to articles about financial planning and home renovation as if the apartment required her input. She started referencing our home when she talked about Birchwood Lane, and the first time I noticed it, we were at a Sunday lunch in her own kitchen, and she said, I was thinking the other day about our home, and I wonder if the balcony should have a proper awning before summer comes. I looked at Daniel, and he said, "That's not a bad idea, actually," and moved on to the next topic, and I sat there thinking, did I hear that right? Did she say our home? I didn't correct her. I should have. I know that now, with the particular clarity that only comes after everything has already burned down. But I smiled and passed the breadbasket and told myself I was being oversensitive. 3 months after the wedding, Eleanor called on a Tuesday evening with what she described as a small problem. Her building was undergoing extensive pipe repairs, and tenants had been asked to temporarily vacate their units for what was supposed to be 2 to 4 weeks. She was sorry to ask. She hated to impose. But was there any possibility, any at all, that she could stay with us in the meantime? She'd be no trouble, she promised. She'd hardly be there. She'd cook. She'd help with cleaning. She'd stay out of our way completely. Daniel looked at me with his most open, most sincere face, the one I'd never been able to say no to, and I said, of course. Of course she could stay. 2 to 4 weeks. I could manage 2 to 4 weeks with absolutely anyone. She arrived on a Friday afternoon with 4 large suitcases, 2 duffel bags, a crated collection of framed photographs, and a garment bag on a hanger. She took the guest room, barely large enough for the bed and the narrow dresser. And within 48 hours, the apartment felt different, smaller, more contested, as if an invisible boundary had been quietly redrawn overnight. Eleanor was awake before both of us, and by the time I came to the kitchen for coffee, she had reorganized the cupboard beneath the sink. By the second morning, the throw pillows on the couch had been rearranged into a pattern I didn't recognize as mine. By the third morning, she had replaced my liquid dish soap with a brand she preferred, and the old bottle was sitting on the counter beside the trash bin like a small, silent eviction notice. I picked it up, put it back under the sink, and said nothing. Daniel was in the shower. There was no one to say nothing to but the walls. I told myself it was harmless. I told myself she needed to feel useful, that she was a woman who expressed love through acts of domestic management. I reorganized the throw pillows back that same evening, and Eleanor watched me do it from the armchair across the room without comment, and that was somehow worse than if she'd said something. That stillness, that measured, patient observation, as if she were simply noting data for future reference. Daniel held me that night and said his mother was just like that. She needed to feel useful. 2 more weeks and she'd be gone. I breathed through it. The lights began the second week. It started with a comment, almost casual. One evening, when I came home late from work and passed through the kitchen without turning on the overhead light, using just the under-cabinet lighting because I found it softer on my eyes after 10 hours of staring at spreadsheets under fluorescent office bulbs. Eleanor was in the living room with her knitting, and she called out loud enough that Daniel looked up from his book. "Clara, you really should use the proper lighting. You'll ruin your eyes." I said thank you. I was fine. I actually preferred it this way. She said it wasn't just about my eyes. It was about the electricity bill. I said I'd be happy to cover whatever the increase came to. There was a pause. The particular kind of pause Eleanor deployed with surgical precision, the kind that said she was choosing not to say the thing she was actually thinking. And then she said very quietly, in a voice that carried without being raised, "In this house, we don't waste." And something about the way she said it, "in this house," made the hairs on the back of my neck rise slowly, one by one. After that, every light in the apartment became a battleground. If I left the bathroom light on while brushing my teeth and stepped into the hallway for 30 seconds, Eleanor was there when I came back, standing in the doorway with her hand still on the switch, watching me return with an expression of mild, patient correction. If I left the kitchen light on while I went to the balcony to water my tomatoes, I'd come back to darkness and Eleanor moving quietly away from the switch. It was relentless, methodical, and it happened in complete silence, which was the most unnerving part. She never raised her voice. She would simply appear near whatever light she'd switched off, look at me, and sometimes say, "It adds up, dear," in her pleasant, factual tone, and sometimes say nothing at all. Both were terrible in different ways. I talked to Daniel about it one night after Eleanor had gone to bed, keeping my voice low, choosing my words with care. I told him I felt monitored. I told him it was my apartment, that I'd paid the electricity bill for years before either of them arrived in my life. He listened. He really did seem to listen. And then he said, "Clara, she's 63 years old and she spent 30 years watching every penny. It's just a reflex." I stared at him. "She switches off the lights while I'm still using them, Daniel." He gave me the look, patient, slightly weary, and said, "I'll talk to her." And I believed him, and he either never had that conversation or it had no effect at all, because the next morning I left the living room light on when I walked to the kitchen, and I came back to darkness and Eleanor standing exactly where I had been sitting, her expression as serene as a woman in a painting. 2 weeks became 3. 3 became 4. I called Eleanor's building management company one afternoon. The woman I spoke to checked the records and told me, without hesitation, that the repairs had been completed 11 days ago and tenants had been notified by letter. I thanked her and hung up. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the courtyard through the window and thought about those 11 days. 11 days Eleanor had known and said nothing, and felt the first real cold premonition of something larger and more deliberate than I'd allowed myself to imagine. When I told Daniel, he went pale. He said he hadn't known. He said he would talk to her. The conversation lasted nearly an hour behind the closed guest room door. When he came out, his face was carefully neutral, and he said his mother had explained that going back alone had felt overwhelming, that she'd been anxious, that she just needed a few more days. He looked at me with eyes asking me to be kind. I looked back at him and thought, with a clarity that frightened me, he knows there's more. He knows, and he's choosing not to tell me. The night it finally happened, I had worked a 12-hour shift. I came through the front door at nearly 9 in the evening, dropped my bag, and stood in the hallway with my eyes closed, just breathing. The apartment was quiet. Daniel was at a work dinner. I went to the bathroom, washed my face, changed into soft cotton. I was so tired I moved on autopilot. And in the kitchen, without thinking, I turned on every light: the overhead, the under cabinet strip, the small ceramic lamp on the kitchen table that I'd had since my first apartment, the one with the cracked base I'd repaired with epoxy and kept anyway because I loved the warm amber glow it made. I stood at the counter and cut bread and sliced cheese and listened to the refrigerator hum and thought about nothing at all, which was the most peaceful I'd felt in weeks. I heard her before I saw her. The footsteps in the hallway were deliberate, measured. Not her usual brisk pace, but something slower, almost ceremonial. Eleanor appeared in the kitchen doorway in her robe, her silver hair neat even at 9 in the evening, her eyes moving over the kitchen in that quiet inventory sweep. She looked at the overhead light, at the under cabinet strip, at the small lamp. Her gaze traveled from fixture to fixture like a prosecutor reviewing evidence, and then it settled on me. The silence stretched, and then she said, in a voice that was almost gentle, "Clara, we've talked about this." I put down the bread knife. I said, very carefully, "Eleanor, I've had a very long day. I'll turn off the lights I don't need when I'm done." She crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and switched off the under cabinet lighting. The next few seconds happened in a way I still struggle to assemble into a coherent sequence because my brain refused to process them as real. She turned from the switch. She looked at me, and then her right hand, small, ringed, precise, came across my face, not hard enough to knock me sideways, hard enough to make my left ear ring, hard enough that I reached out and grabbed the edge of the counter with both hands and stood very still, because my body seemed to understand what my mind could not yet accept, that this had just happened. that my mother-in-law had just struck me across the face, in my kitchen, in my apartment, over a light. I looked at her. Her expression had not changed. It was still the same composed, mildly disapproving expression she might have worn if she'd found a dish left unwashed in the sink. Calm, certain of its own authority, utterly untroubled by what she had just done. She reached past me, close enough that I could smell her perfume, something powdery, floral, insistently old-fashioned, and switched off the overhead light, leaving only the small amber glow of my cracked ceramic lamp. She looked at me one more time, and she said, "No wasteful women in my house." Her house. I stood there in the half-dark, both hands on the counter, and I did not move. The lamp threw shadows up the walls. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere in the building above us, a door closed. Eleanor turned and walked back down the hallway, and I listened to her footsteps, and then the sound of the guest room door closing, and then silence. My face was still warm where she'd struck it, and I thought, with a slowness that felt almost dreamlike, this is the beginning, not the end. This is the very beginning of something I do not yet have the shape of. I did not tell Daniel that night. He came home after 11 smelling of restaurant wine and found me in bed with the light off, and I lay very still while he moved quietly through the dark apartment so as not to wake me, and I stared at the ceiling and listened to him brush his teeth and get into bed and fall asleep with the easy, untroubled breathing of a man who did not know what had happened in his kitchen 3 hours ago. I listened to that breathing for a long time. I thought about the warmth still in my cheek, which had faded to a dull, specific ache by then. I thought about what I would say in the morning, and how I would say it, and whether saying it would change anything at all. I told him at breakfast. Eleanor was in the guest room. I could hear the faint sound of her morning program through the door, and Daniel was standing at the counter with his coffee, still in his work clothes from the night before, and I sat down at the kitchen table and said very quietly, "Your mother hit me last night." He turned. His face went through several things quickly: confusion, disbelief, something that might have been anger. And then it settled into that careful neutrality I had come to recognize as his default when the situation required him to process before he could react. He put his mug down. He said, "What?" I told him exactly what had happened. I told him about the lights, about the comment, about her crossing the kitchen, about her hand on my face. I told him about what she had said afterward. He listened to all of it without interrupting, and when I finished, the kitchen was very quiet, and he said, "Clara, she's never done anything like that before." I looked at him. "I know," I said. "She did it last night." What he did next is something I have turned over in my mind many times since. He did not go to the guest room. He did not raise his voice. He did not take my hand across the table. He picked up his coffee mug, took a long sip, set it back down, and said, "Let me talk to her." And then he walked down the hallway, knocked once on the guest room door, and went inside. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the courtyard. I waited. The conversation behind the door lasted 6 minutes. I counted. When Daniel came out, his expression was one I had never quite seen before. Not the careful neutrality, but something more strained, something around the eyes that looked almost like apology. He said, "She says she doesn't remember it happening that way." I said, "What way does she remember it happening?" He said, "She says she might have been gesturing and accidentally caught you." I said nothing. The silence between us was a third presence at the table. He said, "Clara, I believe you. I do. But she's not going to—" I said, "I know she's not going to admit it." He nodded. He looked relieved that I understood. I was not sure, in that moment, whether I wanted to scream or simply leave. It happened again that evening. Daniel was home this time, sitting in the living room with his laptop. And I was in the hallway reaching for my coat on the rack, and I had left the hallway light on, and Eleanor came out of the guest room and switched it off as I was standing directly beneath it. I switched it back on. I turned to face her in the sudden brightness. I said, "Please don't do that." She looked at me for a long moment, and then she hit me again. The same hand, the same cheek, almost the same precise angle, as if it were a correction she had administered many times before and knew well how to deliver. I heard Daniel's chair scrape back in the living room. I stood perfectly still, holding my coat, looking at Eleanor's face. She said, "Respect the house rules, Clara." And then she walked past me toward the kitchen. Daniel appeared in the hallway. He had heard it. The sound, the silence, perhaps the small involuntary noise I'd made. He looked at me. He looked at Eleanor's retreating back. He said, "Mom." Just that. One syllable, uncertain, almost questioning. She did not turn around. He said, "Mom, you can't." She said from the kitchen, "She knows the rules, Daniel." And he stood there in the hallway, and I stood there in the hallway, and he looked at me with an expression that I can only describe as tormented. A man being pulled in two directions simultaneously and beginning to understand that he could not survive the tension much longer. And he said, "We'll talk about this later. All three of us." We did not talk about it later. Not that night. By the end of the first week, she had hit me 6 more times. I have counted them since many times in the way you count things that your mind cannot otherwise make sense of. Once for the lamp I left on in the bedroom when I went to get a glass of water at midnight. Once for the porch light I switched on when I went to water the balcony plants at dusk. Once when I turned on the kitchen overhead while making dinner because the under-cabinet light was not enough for the recipe I was following. Once in the morning when Daniel was in the shower, over the bathroom light I'd left on in the hallway while carrying laundry. She came up behind me, and I didn't hear her until it happened. Once in the afternoon when she said she'd told me twice about the living room lamp. Once. And this was the one that frightened me most, not because it was harder than the others, but because of how completely calm she was when she did it. When I got home from a grocery run and switched on the kitchen light out of pure reflex, before I'd even set the bags down, she was standing at the sink. She turned around. She looked at my hand on the switch. And she hit me before I'd taken a second step into the room, as if the action itself, the reaching for the switch, the automatic expectation of light in my own home, was the offense. 8 times total, 2 more to come. Daniel's behavior during this period is something I have tried very hard to understand without letting understanding become excuse. He did not hit me. He was not cruel in the ways men are sometimes cruel, but he was present for 3 of the 8 incidents, and in all 3 cases, his response followed the same arc. The chair scraping back, the appearance in the doorway, the one-syllable utterance of "Mom," the look at me that said I know, the look at his mother's back that said I cannot, and then the retreat into whatever room he'd come from which he would emerge later with a cup of tea and a quiet, careful voice and some version of the sentence, "I'm going to fix this, I promise." He never fixed it. And gradually I began to understand that the promise itself was the mechanism. That as long as he kept promising, he never had to act. And as long as he never acted, the situation never resolved. And as long as it never resolved, his mother stayed. In the apartment, she had already started calling her house. The discovery happened on a Thursday, the day before the 9th time. I had come home early. A meeting had been canceled, a rare gift of an afternoon. And the apartment was quiet. Daniel was at work. Eleanor, I assumed, was at her weekly hair appointment, which she had mentioned at breakfast. I made tea and sat at the kitchen table for a few minutes simply existing in the silence, which felt like a luxury. Then I went to the bedroom to change, and as I passed the guest room, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. I did not intend to go in. I had never gone in uninvited. But something caught my eye through the gap. A flash of white on the desk that Eleanor had brought with her, a small folding table she'd set up beside the window. And I pushed the door open 1 inch, and then 2, and then I saw what was on the desk. It was a legal document. several pages printed and stacked with the corners aligned in the way Eleanor aligned everything. I could see from the doorway the official letterhead of a law firm. I could see the words, "Power of Attorney" in bold at the top of the first page. I could see Daniel's name. I could see my name. I could see the property address of Birchwood Lane. My hands were steady as I crossed the room. My hands were steady as I picked up the document. My hands were steady through the first page and the second and the third, which was the last. And by then my hands had stopped being steady, and I was sitting on the edge of Eleanor's guest bed because my legs had decided, without consulting me, that standing was no longer viable. The document was a power of attorney, granting Eleanor full legal authority to act on behalf of Daniel in all matters relating to the property at Birchwood Lane, including the right to negotiate, list, and authorize the sale of the property. It was signed by Daniel. It was notarized. The date was 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago, while Eleanor had been living with us, while Daniel had been telling me he'd talk to her, while I had been counting lights and counting blows and telling myself I was managing, the two of them had been in a notary's office signing over the right to sell my apartment. My apartment. The apartment I had bought alone, with my own money, before Daniel and I were married. And I understood in the cold, total way you understand things your body has known before your mind catches up, that I had made a catastrophic error, that I had trusted a document I had never seen, a marriage certificate, to be enough protection, that somewhere in the machinery of our shared life, a piece of paper had been moved or forged or never been what I thought it was. And I understood something else, too, something that settled into my chest like a stone dropping into still water. Daniel had not been a bystander. Daniel had been a participant. Every time he had stood in a doorway and said nothing, it had not been weakness. It had been management. He had been managing me, keeping me just calm enough, just hopeful enough, just exhausted enough. While his mother consolidated the ground beneath my feet, I put the document back on the desk. I aligned the corners exactly as they had been. I walked out of the guest room, pulling the door to its original angle. I went to the kitchen and poured the rest of my tea down the sink and stood at the window and watched a sparrow on the courtyard ledge for a long time. And I felt something happen inside me that I do not have a better word for than a closing, something that had been open. Some door I had kept ajar out of love, out of hope, out of the particular stubbornness of a woman who believed that good faith was enough, swung shut quietly and latched from the inside. I was not hot with anger. I was something colder and more precise. I was finished. I called my father that evening from the parking garage of the supermarket, 3 blocks from the apartment with the engine running. My father is a retired civil attorney, 67 years old, and he has a voice like a man who has heard everything and been surprised by very little of it. I told him what I had found. I told him the timeline. I told him about the hitting, which I had not told him before. And when I finished, there was a silence on his end that was different from Daniel's silences. This one had weight to it, the weight of someone deciding how precisely they were going to be angry on your behalf. He said, "Clara, listen to me carefully. Do not confront them tonight. Go back to the apartment, behave normally, and tomorrow morning you come to my office. Bring anything you can photograph without moving." I said, "I already photographed it." He said, "That's my girl." The 9th time was the next morning, and it was different from the others. Daniel had already left for work. I was in the kitchen, the overhead light on, the under cabinet on, both of them deliberately, because I had decided that the era of extinguishing myself had ended. And Eleanor came in and stood in the doorway and looked at the lights and looked at me. And I looked back at her. I did not switch anything off. I did not speak. I held her gaze with the specific, level steadiness of someone who now knows exactly what they are looking at. Something moved across her face, not quite uncertainty, because I do not think Eleanor was a woman much acquainted with uncertainty, but something adjacent to it, a slight recalibration. And then she crossed the room and hit me again, harder than she had before, and this time I did not grab the counter. I stood straight and I looked at her, and I said, "That was the last time." She looked at me. She said, "You don't make the rules here." I said, "I do. It's my house." She hit me one more time, the 10th, and it was the hardest of all, the only one that left a mark that lasted more than an hour, and I felt it through my whole skull, and I thought, very clearly, in the ringing that followed, "Good, good. I have what I need." I drove to my father's office, and I did not cry in the car. My father met me at the door, and he saw my face, saw the mark, which had risen to a bruise by then, and his expression went through something private, and then resolved into the focused stillness of a man with a plan. He photographed my face. He called his colleague Margaret, a family law attorney with 30 years of experience and a reputation that made opposing counsel call her before filing anything. He called a forensic document specialist. He called a locksmith. And then he sat across from me at his desk and said, "Walk me through the marriage certificate situation. All of it." What he found, 2 days later, through the forensic specialist and a thorough review of the county property records, was something that turned the ground beneath my feet into solid rock where I'd been standing on ice for months. The power of attorney Eleanor had Daniel sign was legally unenforceable because the property at Birchwood Lane had been purchased before the marriage and had never been transferred into joint ownership. I had never added Daniel to the deed. I had meant to. It had been a conversation we'd had early in the marriage, something we'd said we'd get to, and I had never gotten to it. And in this case, my procrastination was the most fortuitous thing I had ever failed to do. The apartment was mine, entirely and unambiguously, and no document signed by Daniel granted Eleanor or anyone else any authority over it whatsoever. The power of attorney was not only ineffective, it had been prepared using materially false assertions about the ownership status of the property, which meant the law firm that had drawn it up had either been misled or had failed to do the most basic verification. My father made a note about that law firm. His expression when he made the note was not a kind one. The confrontation happened on a Saturday. I chose Saturday because Daniel would be home and there would be no excuse for anyone to leave. I drove to Birchwood Lane in the late morning, let myself in with my key, and found them both in the living room, Eleanor on the couch with her knitting, Daniel standing at the window with his phone, and the tableau was so domestic, so precisely what they wanted me to see, that it almost made me laugh. I set my bag down. I sat in the armchair across from Eleanor. I said, "I'd like to talk about the power of attorney." The silence that followed was one of the more interesting silences of my life. Eleanor's needles paused mid-stitch. Daniel turned from the window, and his face, the face I had loved, the face I still loved, in the complicated way you continue to love something even as you understand it has been used as a weapon against you, went through 5 distinct expressions in about 2 seconds. He said, "Clara." I said, "I found it in the guest room. 3 weeks ago, Daniel. 3 weeks ago, while she was living in my apartment, while you were telling me you'd handle things." He said, "It's not what you think." I said, "Tell me what it is." Eleanor set down her knitting with the precise, unhurried movements of a woman who has rehearsed this moment. She said, "Clara, I know this looks concerning, but I was only trying to protect Daniel's interests. You own this apartment outright, which means if anything were to happen to your marriage—" I said, "You were going to sell my apartment." She said, "I was ensuring that Daniel—" I said, "You were going to sell my apartment, which you have no legal right to do, because Daniel has no legal right to it, because I never added him to the deed, and the property is mine, and the document you had him sign is worth exactly nothing." The needles were still. The room was very quiet. Eleanor looked at me, and for the first time in the months I had known her, She looked uncertain, not remorseful. She was not built for remorse, but uncertain, recalculating, looking for the angle she hadn't anticipated. There wasn't one. I had closed them all. Daniel sat down on the couch. He put his face in his hands. I watched him for a moment and felt, rather than anger, something like exhaustion. The exhaustion of a woman who had loved someone carefully and been answered with carelessness. I said, "How long have you known about her plan?" He said into his hands, "It wasn't a plan, she just—" I said, "How long?" He said, "She mentioned it. Before she moved in, she said she wanted to make sure that if things ever went wrong, she could—" He stopped. I said, "She could sell my apartment." He said nothing. Eleanor said, "Clara, you need to understand that from where I stand, you are a woman who has been married to my son for 2 years, and you own a property that he lives in and has no claim to. That is not fair to him. That is not a stable foundation for a marriage." I looked at her. I said, "You hit me 10 times in this kitchen. You hit me over the lights." She said, "I was correcting behavior that—" I said, "You hit me." The word was so flat and final that it stopped her completely. I reached into my bag and placed on the coffee table, in a neat stack, the photographs my father had taken of my bruise, a written statement I had made for Margaret, the family law attorney, a letter from Margaret addressed to Eleanor, notifying her of the pending report to law enforcement regarding the incidents of physical assault, a letter to the law firm that had drawn up the power of attorney, notifying them of the intent to file a complaint with the state bar regarding their failure to verify ownership documentation, a letter to Daniel from Margaret regarding the legal exposure he faced as a signatory on a document prepared using false information. I placed them one by one, in silence, with the slowness of a woman who has time, and then I sat back and looked at Eleanor. She picked up one of the letters. She read it. She set it down. Something in her face shifted. Not the composure, not quite, but something behind the composure, some load-bearing element that had been holding the whole structure up. She said, "You are being very dramatic." I said, "I have a bruise on my face from 10 days ago." She said, "You are destroying this family." I said, "You did that. 11 days ago, you could have gone home. The repairs were done." The silence that followed was different from all the previous silences. It had no air in it. Daniel lifted his face from his hands and looked at his mother, and it was the first time I had ever seen him look at her the way you look at something you are afraid of. He said, "The repairs were done 11 days. He stopped. He said, "Mom." And this time, the one syllable had a different quality. This time it was an ending. Eleanor stood up. She gathered her knitting with her small, precise hands. She walked to the guest room and she closed the door, and through it we could hear the methodical sounds of drawers opening and closing, of suitcase wheels on hardwood, of a woman packing with the same controlled efficiency with which she did everything. Daniel sat on the couch and looked at the stack of letters on the coffee table and did not speak for a long time. When he finally looked at me, his eyes were wet. He said, "Clara, I am so sorry." I said, "I know." He said, "I didn't think she would." I said, "You knew exactly what she would. You stood in this kitchen 8 times while she hit me." He flinched. He said, "I know." I said, "That's not enough." He said, "I know that, too." Eleanor left that afternoon in a taxi with her 4 suitcases and her duffel bags and her garment bag, and I stood on the balcony among my terracotta pots and watched the taxi pull out of the courtyard and turn onto the street and disappear. The bar complaint against the law firm was filed the following week and resulted in a formal reprimand and a fine. Eleanor was interviewed twice by local police regarding the assault allegations. She was not charged in the end, but the interviews were documented, and Margaret made sure the documentation was thorough and permanent. The power of attorney was formally nullified by written notice to all relevant parties. My name, and only my name, remained on the deed to Birchwood Lane. Daniel and I did not end immediately. We tried for 4 months with a therapist who was patient and honest, and who, in our third session, said something I had already known but needed to hear from someone outside the room. A partner who witnesses harm and remains silent is participating in it. Daniel heard that sentence the way you hear a sentence that confirms what you already know about yourself. He wept. I sat beside him and held his hand and felt the particular grief of loving someone you have already begun to leave. We ended in the autumn, without a fight, with a conversation on the couch that lasted 2 hours and ended with him saying he understood and me believing him. That was 14 months ago. The apartment on Birchwood Lane still smells like coffee in the mornings and wood polish on weekends, and the hardwood floors still creak pleasantly underfoot, and my tomatoes are back on the balcony in their terracotta pots. 3 of them this year, and a basil plant that has gotten completely out of control and which I refuse to cut back. Last Tuesday, I came home from work at 6 in the evening, dropped my bag by the coat rack, and turned on every light in the apartment. The overhead, the under cabinet strip, the hallway lamp, the small ceramic table lamp with the cracked base. All of them, blazing and warm and entirely mine. I stood in the kitchen in the light and made dinner, and listened to a jazz record and ate at the table alone. And the silence was the good kind, the kind that belongs to you. There is a particular freedom in understanding exactly where your life begins and ends, not where someone else decided it should begin and end, not where someone else drew the line when you weren't looking, but where you drew it yourself with full knowledge of the cost in a room full of light.